Morning, everyone. My name is Chris Paoli, RedmanMag.com editor, and I'm pleased to be moderating our first session, as well as welcoming you to our Microsoft Teams Best Practices Summit, brought to you by our masterclass sponsor, Vonage and AvePoint. We will be hosting our follow-up masterclass webcast on March 1st, sponsored by Vonage, so be sure to check that out. There's a link to the registration on today's console, so we hope you can tune in for that great event. Before we start today's event with these three great sessions, we do have some announcements. First, we wanted to let you know this event is being recorded and will be available for future viewing. You'll receive an email when the replay is available, generally within the next few days. Each of today's three sessions will be followed by a 5 to 10 minute Q&A. So please be sure to put your questions into the Q&A area of your console as they come up so we can get them answered for you. During today's third session, we will be giving away an Ooni pizza oven, but you must be present to win. So be sure to stay on for the entire event. Finally, we do have some great resources from our sponsors Vonage and AvePoint available on the console right now. So please check those out so we can bring you more events in the future. Now on to the first session of today's summit, Microsoft Teams Security Best Practices. This session features Ben Stejink, owner and chief cloud consultant at Intelligent. Ben focuses on the Microsoft Intelligent Cloud, Microsoft 365, and Azure. He has 15 plus years of experience with SharePoint, 9 plus years of experience with Microsoft 365, and is a Microsoft certified trainer. Ben also co-hosts the MS Cloud IT Pro podcast, where he discusses the latest technologies in the Microsoft 365 and Azure space from an IT Pro point of view. Take it away, Ben.
All right. Thank you, Chris. Glad to be here today with everybody talking about Microsoft Teams security. Like Chris said, I do work for Intelligent. I actually recently was awarded the Microsoft MVP status as well for Microsoft 365 apps and services. Have the podcast, if you want to go check that out, every week for going on 5 years now, where we talk all about Microsoft 365, Azure, IT Pro stuff. And if you want to find me, if you want to connect afterwards, if I don't get to your question afterwards and you want to follow up on it, feel free to reach out via LinkedIn. That's probably the best place to get me. I am also still active on Twitter, Mastodon. You can go find me pretty much anywhere. Just search for my name too. Search for Ben Stejink. I am the only Ben Stejink out there as far as I have ever been able to find. So if you Google, Bing, DuckDuckGo, whatever search engine you want, use that, search for Ben Stejink, you'll come across websites, LinkedIn, podcasts, all of that good stuff. And happy to connect with you on any of those platforms. So diving in to today's topic and security in Microsoft 365. I'm going to take a look at it from three different approaches when it comes to security in Microsoft 365. So Microsoft 365 security best practices. I'm going to show you different best practices, different features and functionality you can use within Microsoft Teams to secure different aspects of it. Best practices is always a little goofy because there are absolutely things everybody should go set up. Things like multi-factor authentication. Everybody should have it on. But there's other things within Microsoft Teams where it's a little bit of, these are best practices in terms of features and functionality you should be aware of that you can go in and tweak, you can customize to meet the requirements for the security of your particular organization. Because as you know, security can vary from company to company as you start diving into it, as you start dealing with different content that you may have, different segments, different markets that you are involved in. So as we go through today, we're going to look at each of these three topics around what you're trying to secure within Microsoft Teams. I'm going to give a demo as well within each of these categories. Sometimes I'll do all slides. Today we're going to mix it up, do some demos. So if you do have questions, especially related to one of the demos, or if there's something we talk about that you want to see in the demo, I'll try to keep an eye on the Q&A too, so that if we're in the demo and I can address the question as we go, I'll do that. So the first of these is going to be the access to Microsoft Teams. Who can access it? What can they access? Where can they access it from? So just that high level, how are you allowing people to get to Microsoft Teams? After that, we're going to dive in what users can do. Policies, functionality. Once a user has access to Microsoft Teams, what is it that those users can do within Microsoft Teams? And then finally, we're going to look at when can users actually perform those different actions. So they've gotten into Teams. You may have functionality around what they can and can't do, but what if you want some flexibility? In terms of maybe sometimes they can copy and paste into chat, and other times they can't copy and paste in the chat. That's going to be the last aspect we will look at, primarily around sensitivity labels and some new things that Microsoft has started to do with sensitivity labels in that Microsoft Teams space. So the first of these, securing access to Microsoft Teams. The first thing, and I think everybody's pretty familiar with this by now, is Azure Active Directory. Going in and making sure you have everything configured properly within Azure Active Directory when it comes to users' access to Microsoft 365, and then more specifically to Teams. And there's a couple things to think about when it comes to Azure Active Directory. The first of these is limiting Teams creation. This is one that can be a little bit of a hot topic. And again, I've seen organizations take different approaches to this. But what is your stance on, do you want every user in your organization to be able to go in and create a team every time they want to? Or do you need to go in and be able to limit it so you don't get the sprawl, you don't get teams created everywhere with people putting content in all of these teams? I tend to err more on the side of you probably want to put some type of controls around your team's creation. It doesn't necessarily have to be that IT has to create every team. Maybe it's a workflow that you put in place. Maybe it's a request form that automatically goes and creates the team. But just something there to help that process. Because I've gone into organizations before and looked at the teams, and they have teams for like Susie's retirement party, or they have a team for the company holiday party, where people don't understand necessarily what creating a team is. They click on the join create team thinking that maybe it's, I just need a team that I want to talk to. Thinking of it more from a group conversation standpoint, pretty soon they end up with a team, they end up with a SharePoint site associated with it. They start putting files out there, and you have a ton of teams, you have a ton of content, and you really don't know what's out there. It provides opportunities for maybe data to be compromised or communication to take place that you're not aware of. So limiting teams creation. And then the MFA. I mentioned this already. What are you doing around password policies, making sure MFA is in place, maybe doing passwordless, that type of stuff. The next layer on top of that, when it comes to securing access, is conditional access. Who can access Teams? Where can they access it from? Which device can they use? I joked before on these presentations, I somehow managed to tie conditional access into every single presentation I give, because I think this is one of the most powerful features in Azure Active Directory when it comes to security. Going in and not letting someone sign into Microsoft Teams from a computer in the store. Making sure they're on a trusted device or a registered device. Making sure it's a device that's maybe registered to your Azure Active Directory instance. Setting certain controls around when and where people can access Teams from, so you don't end up with someone that forgets to sign out of Teams over at their friend's house. Or again, they're in the store, logging into a computer, they just want to quick check their email or something, they hop on Teams, they forget to sign out. Next person walks up and Teams is left logged in. You can even set browser persistence now in conditional access. So when somebody closes the browser, it's automatically going to log them out. It doesn't remember that user from session to session when they log in. So I think knowing how to configure conditional access, getting that set up, getting some of those policies in place when it comes to Microsoft Teams is super important when it comes to Microsoft 365. This is an Azure Active Directory P1 license. I think Azure Active Directory Premium, Plan 1, is worth it alone just for conditional access. I've had clients that have bought Azure Active Directory P1 just for the conditional access feature as well. Next up, when it comes to securing teams, are you creating the right types of teams and the right types of channels for what you want to do and what you want to accomplish? Are you creating everything as public teams and everybody has access to everything in your environment because you're creating public teams? Or should you be creating private teams? And this even goes back to how are you setting up your team's creation? What are you doing to ensure that the right types of teams are getting created, either public or private, to appropriately secure access to those teams, the chats, the content, whatever's associated with those given teams. I said public, you may not add everybody to a public team, but if you create a public team, anybody in your organization can go and find it and add themselves to it. Well, they don't maybe inherently have access. They have the ability to get themselves access versus private where they do have to be explicitly added and approved to get into that team and see the content in it. And then within those teams, you have channel types, going in and setting up the appropriate channel types. Where, again, a public channel within a team, if you go in and create a team and create 10 different public channels in it, everybody that's in that team is going to have access to those public channels, to the content contained in those public channels. The next layer you can go down is the private channels. This can be a private channel within a public team. It can be a private channel within a private team. Setting up private channels, when you do have a certain piece of content or a certain subset of your team users that need access to more privileged information. An example that I have is when I get a new client, I create a team. Usually I still do a private team for clients that has a general channel in it. That's where all the general generic information goes about the client. Then I create an admin team or an admin channel that's a private channel within that client team. This is where I put things like contracts, budgets, more of that admin paperwork that I need access to. I want to be able to go in and manage that. But if I have somebody else working with me on the project, they don't necessarily need to be privy to all of the admin information, the contract information, the budgets, the rates, all of that. So this allows them to be a part of the team. We can have conversations. We can collaborate around files. We can even share files with the client within that team and that general channel. But that admin one, it's only a subset of users, of people that really need to do that admin access. And then with private, the one thing there is in order to be added to a private channel, you do also have to be a member of the parent team. So if you have someone that you need to give access to that private channel, you first have to go in and add them to the team. The final type of channel is shared. And knowing how to use these can also be a benefit from a security perspective. Shared channels are similar to private channels in that they have their own security, but it is independent of the parent team. I can create a shared channel within a public team and give users explicit access to that shared channel without adding them to the team as a whole. So it could come into play somewhat within an organization in terms of wanting users to just be able to get to a single channel. This can also be very beneficial if you are collaborating with external users. Again, my case, I'm working with a client. I want them to be able to have access to a specific channel within that client team where I can work with them, we can share files, we can collaborate, but maybe I don't want them added to the team as a whole. I don't want to invite them as a guest user into the team. If you go in, configure Azure Active Directory appropriately, you can go in and give them access to just this shared channel. There's a lot of little tweaks that have to go on in Azure AD. There's lots of documentation out there. I'm happy to share it if somebody wants it, but knowing, again, those public-private teams, public-private shared channels really goes a long way in terms of securing content and that access to it. So I said I wanted to do all slides, a little bit of a demo here. So we're going to jump over, and I was debating which one to show here. Conditional access is my favorite. So I'm going to show conditional access here. And if you want to see something with some of the others, we can go look at some of those, throw something in the questions. But those are, there's not as much there. Again, once you have them configured, it's more knowing how to create them. So conditional access in Office 365. It is in your Azure Active Directory. So I went to Azure Active Directory, aad.portal.azure.com. You can also go to azure.portal.com, navigate to Azure Active Directory. There's a link to it in your admin center. And then you go into security. I think I'm pretty safe here. Azure Active Directory. This is my live tenant, so I always keep an eye. So Azure Active Directory, security, and then conditional access. Right here, you can see I have a bunch of policies that I already have set up in my environment and turned on. This one's off right now around only allowing Outlook Mobile, but I have some MFA policies, some sign-in policies, MFA policies. I didn't realize I had two of those in there. Idle session timeout policies. But creating a new policy here, we can go in, and let's say we do want to limit this one to just Microsoft Teams. We can go in and say this is our Teams security control policy. And from here, go in and assign it. So I can just assign this to all the users right away if I want to. I can set it up, don't assign it to anybody, or I can go in and do select users. So if I just have certain users I want this to apply to, I can go do that. I can select directory roles. So this is going to be admin type roles. I can also apply this to guest or external users. We'll just leave it to all users for now. And cloud apps. This is where we can go in, and if we did want one that's very specific to Teams, you can go into your cloud apps, select one, search through your cloud apps, and actually select Microsoft Teams. So we now have a conditional access policy. It's going to apply to all our users whenever they access the Microsoft Teams web app, whenever they try to hit that, whether they try to hit it from the desktop client or a browser. This is only going to apply to Microsoft Teams. Now, this is where we can go in and start looking at conditions. If you have E5s, you can do things with user risks or sign-in risks. Device platforms lets you go in and narrow this down. So maybe this one is only going to apply to Windows, Mac OS, and Linux, because we're aiming this one towards people accessing Microsoft Teams from their desktop. We don't want to apply this to mobile devices right now. We can go in and say we're going to apply this to desktops, locations. This can be IP-based. It can also be location-based. So you can see I do have one set up here for countries. I also have one that is specified by certain IP addresses. Those are configured back in security. There is a spot to configure those locations. So you do need to go in and do those first. I'm not going to do a location. Client apps. This is where you can start limiting those apps. So for those desktop apps, maybe you only want it to be accessible from the browser. So you don't want them to be able to use the desktop client to sign into Teams. You can limit it to just the browser. You can say they're going to be able to use the desktop apps, the client apps. Legacy off, this is going to apply a little bit more to Exchange than it would to Teams. But you can go set up client apps. So maybe you don't want them to use the browser. You only want them to use desktop applications. Go uncheck your legacy ones. And then filter for devices. This is a new feature that Microsoft added. This used to just be related to Azure AD joined, not Azure AD joined, Azure AD registered. These filters now you can do a lot with, whether it's from an inclusive perspective, you want these certain devices to be included or excluded. Now you can go in and set up device IDs. So if you really want to lock this down to specific devices that these users use, or if you know all of the devices in your company are from a certain manufacturer, you can go set this up based on manufacturer type, set it up based on operating systems. Trust type is going to be your join or not. So some of these are those multiple choice. It's not just a straight text field that you write the query for, but you can go in and say, this is going to be only Azure AD joined devices. So that computer that's at home in their basement that the whole family uses, you don't want them to be able to use Teams for that. You only want it to be on that work device that's joined your Azure Active Directory environment. You can go in and configure that policy, so now they can only access Teams from the desktop client on a device that's been joined to Azure Active Directory. So this is all kind of, what's that scenario? What are you targeting this device towards? Which users, which devices, which cases is this going to apply? And then you can go in and say, all right, this is the case it's going to apply. Now, in that case, am I actually going to just block access? So you can do it backwards, where it's not joined to Azure AD. It's not registered with Azure AD. I want to just block access. Or in this case, we're going to say, we'll grant access, but we want to require multi-factor authentication. They've added some new ones here, too, around require authentication strength. So this can be things like you're going to force passwordless, or you're going to force it to be a phishing-resistant MFA. You're going to block things like SMS, and you're going to lock it down to FIDO2 security keys or using some of the other passwordless authentication methods. Device compliance, approved client apps. So Microsoft has their list of approved client apps. So you can say it has to be from a client app. It can't be from an untrusted third-party application. You're going to require a password change when they access it. So going back to some of our earlier policies, maybe they try to access Teams. They've been flagged as a risky user. You're going to allow them in, but you want to require them to do a password change first. And then if you're going to require one or all of these controls, maybe you want to require multi-factor authentication, and you want to require it to be hybrid Azure AD joined. You can go in and say, I need it to be all of these, or one of these is okay in this scenario. And then finally, session. I talked about this one. This is where you can start going in and configuring some of that persistence for your browser session, or some resilience. Most of the ones I've seen in here, people tend to use sign-in frequency and persistence. When you start getting into continuous access evaluation, conditional access app control, they're a little different. They start tying into Cloud App Security. But this browser persistence is really nice if you're, and you have to do it for all Cloud Apps. You can't do it for just Teams. But if you're targeting browser-only access, this is where you could go in and say, when we're not going to maintain persistence of that user's sign-in from one browser session to the next, or you're going to allow it. So a few things in session controls. Again, these tend to be very specific scenarios. These top four tend to be the ones that people target the most, do the most configuration in. Once you're done with it, report only. If you want to just get a report on when a certain policy would apply, it would show up in the audit logs. You can create one, turn it off. I usually start with report on only. You can turn it on, and you will see that when you turn these on certain places in here, Microsoft will give you a warning. Don't lock yourself out. Teams, we're pretty safe. We can get back in and turn it off. If you're applying this to all your cloud apps, it is possible to lock yourself out of your entire Microsoft 365 and Azure environment. So take care when you're assigning these to all users. Maybe you want to go in and exclude a user. I tend to exclude a special admin user that I have when I go set up these policies, just so I have a way back in after I turn it on if I've messed something up and I get in that scenario where I lock myself out. So conditional access, again, really powerful when you're going in and configuring security to Microsoft Teams, even for Office 365 as a whole. I guess filter for devices and conditional access requires special Microsoft license. Filter for devices does not. Conditional access is the Azure AD Premium. That filter for devices should be there for any license that includes conditional access. So back to, we turn off that screen share, get back to the slides here. So securing with policy. We talked about Azure AD. The next thing is once they're using Teams, what do you want to allow users to actually do with Teams? There are a lot of different Teams policies that you can set within the Teams Admin Center. And we're going to go look at some of those in a minute. The Teams and apps. What third-party apps do you want to allow in? What are some of those settings in Teams that you want to allow around third-party file storage? So are you going to allow in your cloud storage setting for Teams, there's 5 of them, I think, Box, Google Drive, Ignite, and maybe Citrix ShareFile. I think there are the 5 or 4 that are in there along with SharePoint. So setting up some of those team settings around what are you going to allow. Meeting policies. When can people get into meetings? Some of these meetings policies are, do you want guests to be able to start the meeting so that they could start a meeting, have a conversation, start sharing content, have chats before someone from the company actually joins? Or what do you want to do about anonymous people trying to join your meeting? Scheduling meetings. Who can schedule certain meetings, or when you schedule certain meetings, what are some of the settings you want? Sharing settings you can set if people are allowed to share their entire desktop, or if they are only allowed to share apps. Allowing users to share their entire desktop can be a security vulnerability. You never know what might pop up when they're sharing their entire desktop, whether it's an alert, whether it's a browser window that pops up. Just like I was sharing here, and I was showing my live production tenant. I'm taking care to only show certain things within my production environment, but I click on something wrong. I'm sharing my entire desktop at this point in time. Potentially, you could see something you don't want me to see. So what do you want you to allow the users within your company to share when it comes to sharing within Teams meetings? Chats, there's policies you can set around when people are allowed to chat, when they're not allowed to chat, if external users are allowed to carry on chat conversations within a meeting. Meeting templates, I labeled premium in here, and we'll try to look at a few premium features. I had some issues with my premium licenses today, being that for some reason my tenant doesn't think I actually have them. But meeting templates are a new feature within Microsoft Teams Premium that allow you to pre-configure templates ahead of time so that when you go in and schedule a meeting, you can pick, is this an internal meeting? Is this a confidential meeting? Is this a meeting that is with clients? And have certain settings around recording and roles and chat all set up in those meeting templates ahead of time so that when users join those meetings, they are or are not allowed to do certain things. A confidential meeting, maybe you don't want chat to be there, or maybe you want it to be watermarked. There's some watermarking features now, so if a meeting is recorded, maybe confidential meetings, you just don't want them to be recorded at all. You can go in and set some of that up in meeting templates. With these policies as well, we talked about meeting policies, messaging policies. There are probably 6 or 7 different policy sections that you can set up within Microsoft Teams, and you can assign them to users or to groups. One of the important things to know when you're going in and securing Teams with these policies is how those get ranked. What if a user is assigned to be a direct user? What if they're assigned to be a group? Or what if they fall into the global bucket? So as you're going in and creating these policies and securing Teams with these policies, is think through or keep in mind, if it's assigned directly to a user, that is always going to take precedence. When you're going down the chain, policies assigned to a user, top priority. From there, if the user is in a group, they will get assigned to a policy based on the group, and groups can be ranked low to high. So a user may be in 3 or 4 different groups that have a policy assigned to them. You're going to have to go in and rank those groups 1, 2, and 3, and whatever the highest ranked group that user is in is going to get precedence. If they don't have it assigned directly to them, if they're not in a group that has a policy assigned to it, there is a global org-wide policy for all of these different settings that does allow the user to, that users just kind of fall into if they're not in one of these other ones. The other thing to keep in mind, and this is specific to meeting policies, is this website and this link, and you can go out and grab it from the slides that you can download, gives you an overview of these meeting policies. Meeting policies have certain configuration settings in them, and we can look at these. I do not have these memorized. I go out and look at the documentation. Certain settings are per organizer. So if the organizer of the meeting has a policy set a certain way, that particular policy is going to apply to everybody that joins the meeting, regardless of the policy the user has. So in that case, those per organizer policy settings apply to the entire meeting, to everybody that's in the meeting, regardless of anything else. It's solely dependent on the organizer of the meeting. Some other policy settings are going to be per user, where it doesn't matter what the organizer's policy is, it's going to be based on the individual users coming into the meeting. So different users, in theory, could have different experiences based on how their individual meeting policies are set and those assignments that they have. And then finally, you have per organizer and per user, where it's a combination of the two. It is dependent on a certain setting, via a certain policy setting being applied a certain way to both the organizer and the user. And those can get a little goofy to wrap your head around. And to even keep track that as different people are coming in, how these get applied. But again, keep in mind when there's those meeting policies, go look at the documentation. If you're struggling with it, these are the things, I wanted you to be aware of how the per organizer, per user, per organizer, and per user, that specific scenario around meeting policies just can be a little odd sometimes. So diving into some of these, just taking a quick look at these policies so you can start getting familiar with them. Let me jump back over to my screen share here, and that should pop up. So messaging policies, we're going to our Teams Admin Center. All of these different policies show up in their respective areas in your Team Admin Center. So if you're looking at Teams as a whole, you do have some team policies up here, and these are fairly generic in how they get configured. There's not a lot of settings in this. This is primarily around those channels and teams we talked about earlier. So if you're not going to go limit teams and maybe everybody can create teams, but you want to control maybe who can create those shared channels or those private channels, who can invite some external users. That's going to be at that team's policy level to help maybe lock down those channels or help control what users can create what channels. Template policies are going to start dealing with some of those meeting templates. Update policies, there's not a whole lot up here that I tend to set. The team settings I mentioned, this is where you can go in and limit those files. So if you are using Teams and you don't want files or cloud storage to get added to a team for maybe Dropbox or Google Drive, you may want to go in and actually turn off those file settings so that it only gets limited to SharePoint. You can turn all 5 of them off and say, you know what, our team's only going to go in SharePoint. The meeting policies is one that I wanted to look at, again, because this one is where a lot of it happens. And this is where a lot of content, this is where you can run into security vulnerabilities within Teams. You're on meetings, you're having conversations, people are chatting, people are sharing content. This gets into how you start limiting what goes on in meetings. Whether it is where they can schedule meetings. If you don't want people to be able to use the Meet Now, they should always be scheduled. If you don't want Meet Now in private meetings, some of that. But as you get down further in here, this is some of that security around content sharing and what you want to happen here in terms of who do you want to present? Do you want to allow anyone that's in that meeting to present, or does this have to be limited to only those meeting organizers? So nobody's just going to come in and take over the screen share. When everybody's in a meeting, anybody can click share my screen, kick out whoever's currently sharing the screen, and share their screen. So maybe you want it to be only organizers, co-organizers. You limit it to organization and guests. Or you can just leave it open. Anyone that joins the meeting, they're free to share. That sharing mode I talked about, where if you want people to share their entire screen, or maybe you do want to limit it to just a single application or even certain users, they just don't have a reason to share their screen. You can go set that, turn that off in policies. If external participants can give a request control, this is another interesting one where you're in a meeting, you have an external participant, and they keep clicking up at the top and asking for access. Maybe you don't want to allow those external participants to even request control. Going down to some of the recording and transcripts, if you want meetings to be recorded, meetings automatically expiring. I have my meetings to automatically expire after 180 days. I don't need a bunch of old meeting recordings sitting out there that people can go find. I want those to get deleted. I rarely need to go back and look at a meeting after 180 days. If I do want it longer, it's not saying I can't download it, or I can, when that expiration time comes due, you can say you want to keep it longer. If you're in one of those and for security perspective, you don't want, or you want to store recordings outside of a specific country or region. That's a functionality that's in this policy. Watermarking. This is one of those new premium features. So if you have certain policies where, again, from a security perspective, you don't want meeting recordings to escape, you want people to know they're yours, you can go in and turn on watermarking now for videos or shared content, where it goes in and actually puts an overlay over top of that meeting recording, puts a watermark right on it, so that those recordings, the shared content, this would be, again, screen sharing, application sharing, it's going to put a watermark right over it. Some other policies, we talked about meeting templates. This is one, I do the podcast. So I have a certain template for a podcast or a certain template for a client meeting. I can go in and set up these templates, and this is some of that end-to-end encryption for certain meetings. Again, going back to confidential, maybe you want to enable end-to-end encryption for any meeting that is labeled confidential. You can go in now and set some of that end-to-end encryption. I This is another premium feature. It's there, audio and video, disabling mic or cameras, recording and transcription, certain roles notifying when callers join and leave, whether or not attendees can chat on the meeting, can use reactions, Q&A, different settings. So now when you go in and schedule a meeting, and I had one up here. If you're in Teams and you go click New Meeting, where these show up, and let me go in. Again, I don't want to show mine, and we'll see if this refreshes it. But if you're going to go in now and schedule a new meeting in Teams, it will show up right here. This user isn't in a policy that gets all of those, but it would have a client meeting here or a confidential meeting. I have not seen this show up yet in Teams for the desktop or I haven't seen this show up yet in Outlook if you book it through Outlook. So you do have to schedule them through Microsoft Teams, but it does give you some of that fine-grained control over what types of meetings you want to create. So with keeping an eye on Teams, because I want to get the sensitivity labels too, because this is another really cool one. Let's jump back to the slides here. And sensitivity labels, starting to give you some of the flexibility in how you set these up. We talked about the meeting templates and doing confidential meetings. Sensitivity labels allow you to make some of those same settings, but instead of necessarily tying them to a meeting template, you can go in and start applying these to meetings based on those sensitivity labels and setting up sensitivity labels for when you want to perform encryption or when you want to have watermarks on the recordings, when you want to go in and control presenting or control some of that privacy and sharing when it comes to Teams and SharePoint sites. This one, we're going to go look at a demo of this and making sure I leave a little bit of time for that. And I am on the wrong slide. I moved the wrong slide. There we go, sensitivity labels. This is the slide I was supposed to be on. Giving you some of that flexibility, and this is one that does come, there's a lot of stuff that ties in here when it comes to Teams Premium. I would love to be able to tell you Teams Premium is free, you got all of this stuff with your normal Teams licensing. There is a lot of this that is going to be limited to Teams Premium. And from a security perspective, again, I wish it was cheaper. I don't control the pricing, but there is a lot of security features you get with Teams Premium. Around preventing copy and paste in meeting chats, setting up sensitivity labels for meetings, advanced meeting monitoring and alerting. That one I haven't been able to wrap my head around or find a lot on what's in that meeting monitoring and alerting. Setting up granular recording controls. There's some interesting stuff coming around granular recording controls as well. This one particularly is who can actually initiate the recording, and then encryption, meeting watermarks. So all of this stuff is in Teams Premium. We're going to jump to a quick demo because this one is, again, a lot easier when you show it. And keep my fingers crossed that maybe my licensing straightened itself out while I was talking. So sensitivity labels within Microsoft 365 are over here in the Compliance Center. And you can go in and set up these different labels with different controls around them. I have some around financial information, some around different types of sites. You can see this one is for sites, groups, clients, labels, and I'll show you where some of those surface themselves. But within a label, you can go in and let's create a new sensitivity label that is demo for everything, pick a label color. Oh, duplicate name. I already used that name. Demo 2. Items are going to be files, Power BI dashboards, and now you also have this checkbox here for meetings as a type of item that you can set up these sensitivity labels for. We're not going to do the schematized data assets. You can also set them up for groups and sites. So when you go in and create a new team, because Microsoft Teams are tied hand in hand with groups, you can allow users to choose a sensitivity label when they create a new team. From here, it didn't work. You can go in and apply or remove encryption, content marking. If it realized I actually had a Teams license, I have a bunch of them and it doesn't like them, I would also be able to check protect Teams meetings and chat. And this was working last night and quit working this morning, as demos seem to go sometimes. Once you click next, now you're able to go in and start configuring what does that securing of that content mean. Am I going to let users pick which permissions to assign around encryption when I have encryption on? Or is content going to expire a certain number of days? These are going to be your Teams files, which are stored in SharePoint. Teams files equal SharePoint files. Do those expire on a certain date? Are users going to be allowed to take those files offline from your Teams environment? Or do they have to be connected in order to work on those files that are in Teams or in SharePoint? And then what types of permissions are they going to have? All users, different permissions. Are you going to set up edit rights or save, control print and copy rights of those files that are in Teams? This really allows you to go in and get granular around what users can do with those files that they have stored in Teams when they're classified with a certain sensitivity label. So now you're not setting this at the entirety of the team, but at the files that are labeled a certain way. Let me just remove that so I can get to the next one. You have content marking. This is going to be those watermarks again, footers, headers within files, Office documents, auto labeling. And if you had Teams, I do have a screenshot. I had selected Teams and Meetings, it would have showed up here. I'm sorry, the screenshot's a little blurry. There's not a lot out here. This lets you go in then and based on a sensitivity label for a meeting, control who can bypass the lobby. Does it only have to be people that were invited? Can they just bypass the lobby? Or who's going to be allowed to present? The owners, the co-owners, a lot like what we saw in the policies. End-to-end encryption, this can go in and automatically apply or not apply the watermarks. So instead of setting that at the policy level now, in terms of who can apply watermarks or not, this is going in and at the sensitivity label, applying watermarks in a meeting has a certain sensitivity label, and then some of those prevent copying chat content to the clipboard. So copying and pasting out of chat onto a local machine can now be blocked with these sensitivity labels when they're applied to a Teams meeting. We also talked about groups and sites. This is where, when you create a group or a site, so if I'm in Teams and I click to create a group and I choose a certain sensitivity label, I can now control, is that group or that team public or private based on that sensitivity label? With a certain sensitivity label, can I allow external users access to that particular team? Am I going to go in and control sharing on that team based on the sensitivity label? So I don't want to allow sharing. If this team is labeled confidential, maybe this should only be people in your organization that can share content from that specific Microsoft team. And then you can even go in now and start doing conditional access to the SharePoint site backing the Microsoft team based on a sensitivity label. So you saw those conditional access policies I had set before. You can't do all of them. You have to do some configuration with authorization context and some special settings in conditional access. but you can now go in and customize conditional access policies on a site-by-site basis within Microsoft 365. So really getting granular with these sensitivity labels when you go in and create teams. And the nice thing is this takes the users of having to know some of that, or takes it out of the user's hands. So if I go in, I think I already closed that one. So when I go in now to Teams, and I would go create a new team, and I'm not going to jump to it, along with the private and public, I have a new dialog box when I create a new team that says, what is the sensitivity of this team? And it will force me into certain configuration settings on that team based on that sensitivity label. So that is those three areas. Again, access to Microsoft Teams, going in and setting up policies around what users can and can't do in Teams, and then going through and starting to use sensitivity labels to get even more fine-grained control over kind of on a meeting-by-meeting basis, file-by-file basis, team-by-team basis on what users are allowed to do. So hopefully that gives you some ideas of some of those things that you really should go to look at. And we have a few minutes for some questions, and I saw some come through. So let's get into some of the questions that you all have.
Okay, great. Yeah, let's jump in. Oh, you got this?
Yeah. Nope, go ahead.
Okay, let's start off with Leopold has a great question. If a policy changes, does the user need to log out and log back in for it to populate?
To populate that policy. A lot of times, I will say, if you want it to apply quicker, then yes. I think a lot of those policies, if you give them enough time, they'll automatically kick in, because you still do have, when you get into authorization and how it all works in Microsoft 365, you're going to go in and it does do like refreshes of your access. So give it enough time, it would start applying. For more immediate application of some of those policies, yeah, it's probably going to be log out, log back in. Yet a computer restart really does a log out and log back in, because you're re-authenticating once your computer restarts. There's going to be other ways those will kick in as well.
Okay, is access to Teams a vulnerable attack service for AD?
Let me think. I mean, in theory, I would say, potentially, just in that, and it's not even specific to Teams, but really Office 365 as a whole. Any time you're authenticating to Azure Active, or any time you're authenticating to Microsoft 365, whether it's Word, whether it's SharePoint, whether it's Teams, you're interacting with Azure Active Directory. There's credentials, there's tokens being passed back and forth between wherever you are and between Azure Active Directory. Could you use Teams to somehow get a token, get the information that you needed to then authenticate to Azure Active Directory? Take me as an example. I have global admin access. If you were able to leverage Teams to somehow get a token, that authentication back and forth between Teams and Azure Active Directory, get a token, get my credentials, you could then use those to authenticate to Azure Active Directory and have global admin in Azure Active Directory. Have I heard of that happening before? No, I really haven't. So I haven't heard of that being used that way. There's been a couple of cases where certain applications have stored certain information, like in plain text on your local machine, that were publicized as a potential vector of attack into your environment. I have not heard of one being like globally exploited across the entire environment. So hopefully that helps with that question about that attack surface.
Okay, let's try to get one or two more questions in here. Is there a way to audit for things like how many external users have access to private or public channels or chats?
Let me think. I don't know of a way to run an audit and say this user has access to all of this information. There are access reviews that are a part of the identity management aspect of Microsoft 365, which allows you to run regular reviews and audits of where guests have access. So every 30 days, these guests have access to these particular teams. Should they still have access to that? Because again, there's content, there's chats. There could be other things in there. So it's not necessarily these are all the chats, but it does help with that. This is where you have guests in your tenant that still have access to different teams or files, that sort of thing.
Okay, that looks like all the time we have. Thanks so much, Ben. Those demos were super helpful.
All right, thank you. And again, if I didn't get to somebody's question, you want to reach out, just ping me on LinkedIn. I should have put my email out there. If you want to put my email in the chat, you can push it out there and people can email me, and I am happy to answer any other questions after the fact as well.
Yeah, we'll definitely do that. Everyone stay tuned. We're going to take a short break and be back at the top of the hour for our second session of the day, Microsoft Teams Management and Communications Best Practices. Take a chance to check out those resources on your console, and we'll be right back.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. Thanks again for being here, and thanks to our sponsors, Masterclass sponsor Vonage and AvePoint, for underwriting this summit and allowing us to bring you this great content. I'm David Rammel, editor of Virtualization and Cloud Review, moderating the second session of our summit called Microsoft Teams Management and Communications Best Practices. Our speaker for this session is Brian Posey, a 21-time Microsoft MVP, freelance tech author, and commercial astronaut candidate. Throughout Brian's career, he has written or contributed to dozens of IT books and created numerous full-length video training courses and published thousands of blog posts on a huge variety of IT and space-related topics. Many of those blog posts can be found in his Posey's Tips and Tricks column or in his new Posey's Moonshot column. Brian, it's great to have you here. Please take it away.
Hey, thank you so much, David. Hello, greetings, and welcome, everyone. As David said, I'm Brian Posey, Microsoft MVP and commercial astronaut candidate. The screen actually shows a picture from some underwater spacewalks last fall, and I just got the word yesterday that coming up in April, I'm going to be doing a simulated lunar excursion in the suit that they're building for the upcoming moon mission, so super excited about that. At any rate, let's go ahead and get started with the content. So, as I'm sure you all know, Microsoft Teams became a super mission-critical application for a lot of organizations back in 2020. The world pretty much shut down, and all of a sudden everybody was forced to work from home, and Teams became indispensable. It became the go-to communications portal that made remote work possible for so many people. What's interesting, though, is that at the time that all of that happened, the change was super abrupt. So everybody was forced to just make it work. The mentality at the time for so many companies was, I don't care how you do it, just make it work. Well, right now what we're seeing is everybody taking a step back and trying to correct all of the mistakes that were made way back then and bring teams more into line with the way that things should have been done from the beginning. Now, don't get me wrong. Everybody needed to do what they had to do at the time just to be able to ensure that their businesses were able to continue functioning. But now it's time to go back and take a look at the way that Teams was implemented and correct any mistakes from the past that were introduced by putting Teams into place so hastily. So what I've really been seeing is a huge focus on things like security, governance, and performance. And when I say performance, what I'm really talking about is things like call quality management and things like that. So with that in mind, what I want to talk about today is primarily some security and governance related best practices. So I've got several random or semi-random best practices around these areas. Some of the items that I'm going to be talking about are things that I've covered in previous Teams-related webcasts simply because they are important. Other content that I'm going to be covering is brand new. So hopefully there will be something for everyone in here. And one of the things that I'm going to do that's at least a little bit unique is as I go through these best practices, I'm actually going to show you how to implement them. I've got screen captures. I'll show the process step by step so that you can see what's actually involved in putting these best practices into practice. So let's go ahead and get into it with the first best practice. So best practice number one is standardized team creation with the use of templates. So a template is really just a predefined structure that you can create that simplifies the process of creating a team. A template can contain all kinds of things. It can contain channels, it can contain tabs, it can contain apps, anything that's going to be associated with the teams that are created from that template. So you can develop templates just as a shortcut. If you have users that create teams on a frequent basis, using templates can make the deployment process a little bit easier. But a lot of organizations will use templates as a way of helping to ensure that they're complying with whatever regulations they happen to be subject to. In other words, if there's a certain structure that needs to be applied to teams that are created within a particular organization, using a template is a good way to make sure that that structure is adhered to. So let's take a look at what's involved in setting up a template. So what you see right here is the Microsoft Teams Admin Center. And what I've done is I've expanded the Teams container and I've selected team templates. And right away you'll notice on the slide that there are a number of templates that already exist within Microsoft Teams. And these templates exist basically as a shortcut. Microsoft has done some of the work for you. For example, if you're building a team for the sake of project management, well, there's a template called Manage a Project that has been designed specifically for that purpose. And rather than go in and create a new team from scratch and build the structure for that team, you can choose this template and it will simplify the process. It might not align exactly with the project that you're implementing, but it at least gives you a starting place. And incidentally, all of these pre-built templates are customizable. I'll show you how to do that in just a few minutes. But project management isn't the only type of template that exists by default. As you can see on the slide, there are lots of other templates. There are templates for everything from managing a store to a bank branch to crisis communications, incident responses. So you can build teams around just about anything, and there are all these pre-built templates that can help you with that. Now, if you're building a template from scratch, what you would do is click the Add button next to the big blue arrow on this slide, and then that's going to take you into this wizard that you can see right here. And this wizard gives you three choices. The first choice being create a new template. That's what we're going to be doing here in just a second. The second option is use an existing team as a template. So if you've already got a team in your organization that's working out really, really well, and you want to make sure that future teams are modeled after that team, you can use the second option to use an existing team as a template. And then the third option is to start with an existing template. That's how you go about customizing those templates that I showed you just a moment ago. So if there's a template that Microsoft has built that works for you, but it really needs some adjustment, you would pick this third option, and then that would give you the ability to customize that existing template. So let's suppose that you want to create a new template. You would choose the Create a New Template option, and then click Next, and then that's going to take you to the screen right here. So the first thing that you would have to do here is to enter a name for the template that you're creating, simple enough. And then you'll notice that the short description and the long description are required fields, so you are going to have to provide descriptions. And I recommend going ahead and being as descriptive as you can with these, because over time you may find that you accumulate a large number of templates, and those descriptions can be really helpful with regard to figuring out why a template was created and what it's meant to do and what purpose it's going to serve within your organization. So once you've entered those descriptions, the next thing that you have to do is pick your locale. That's essentially the language that the template is going to be in this case, English. And then you would click Next, and that's going to take you to the screen right here. Now, this is where you provide the content for the template. Specifically, this gives you the chance to add channels, tabs, and apps. Channels and apps are shown on the slide. Tabs are a little bit further down off of the screen. Now, setting this up is really simple. You'll notice that there is an add button under channels and another add button under apps, and that just gives you the opportunity to add whatever channels and apps you want to associate with this particular template. Now, one thing that I do want to point out before I move on is that you'll notice that under channels, there's an edit option and a delete option. And there's also an existing channel called general that's put there by default. Well, the reason why you have that edit and the delete, it goes back to what I was talking about earlier, where you can take a predefined template that was supplied by Microsoft, or you could even do this with one of your own templates if you want, but you can edit the contents of that template. So if, for example, you're using one of the pre-existing templates and it doesn't quite meet your needs, you can add extra channels to it, or you can edit some of the channels that are built into the template, or even delete the ones that just aren't a good fit for your organization. And the same thing for apps. You can add apps to a template, or you can delete apps from a template. Now, it's worth noting that Teams templates aren't the only type of template that you can create in Microsoft Teams. You can also create something called meeting templates. Meeting templates are relatively new, and I'm not going to go into this one in tremendous detail because meeting templates are only available in Teams Premium. And if I'm to be totally honest with you, I don't even have a Teams Premium subscription, so there wasn't really a way for me to get screen captures of meeting templates. But I did want to at least mention them just for the sake of anybody who's listening to this webcast who might have the Teams Premium subscription. The basic idea behind this is that whereas a team template provides the structure for new teams, a meeting template will provide a structure for meetings that you might be having within your organization. So what you can do with that template is you can predefine all of the settings that go into that meeting. I'm talking about things like, do you want to enable Q&A for the meeting? What type of sensitivity label do you want to apply to the meeting content? What about chat? Do you want to allow chat? Do you want to enable join notifications? How about automatic recording? Do you want to turn that on or turn it off? Do you want to allow participants to use their camera and microphone? What about watermarking shared content? Or are there particular meeting attendees who you want to allow to bypass the lobby? These are just a handful of the settings that you can apply to a meeting using a meeting template. So essentially what these templates do is they let you define all manner of security, audio, video recording, and transcription settings related to meetings that are created from that template. That way you never have to wonder, have these particular settings been applied to a meeting? You don't have to wonder if somebody forgot. Suppose that you're in a regulated industry, for example, and you need to have recordings of all of the Teams meetings. I just recently talked to somebody who had exactly that particular situation going on. Well, by using a meeting template, you can ensure that any meetings that are created from that template are automatically recorded. So you never have to worry about falling into that regulatory trap of not having a meeting recorded when it was supposed to have been recorded by law. So that's just a quick introduction to meeting templates. So let's move on to the next best practice. And that best practice is to enforce a consistent team naming policy. Now, in a way, this one is a little bit odd because the best practice, at least as I've spelled it out, is to enforce a consistent team naming policy. But the reason why this is so odd is because there's no such thing as a team naming policy. There's nowhere that you can go into in the Teams Admin Center or anything like that and define a team naming policy. That option doesn't exist. Now, having said that, what you can do is go to the underlying infrastructure. And the infrastructure is something I'm going to be talking a lot more about as we go along in some of the later best practices. But the thing that you need to know for right now is that there's a very, very close relationship between teams that you create and Azure Active Directory groups. Or actually, I guess they're Microsoft 365 groups if we're to be technically precise. But they're created in Azure Active Directory. So in other words, anytime that you create a team, Azure AD is creating a group behind the scenes. So even though you can't define a team naming policy, what you can do is you can define a policy for naming Azure AD groups or groups within Azure AD. So there are a couple of things that we need to talk about with regard to that. First of all, Azure AD naming policies require you to have an Azure AD Premium P1 license. So that is a requirement for group naming policies. Now, another thing that we need to talk about is what this is going to do from the end user perspective. Because think about this for a moment. Let's suppose that you have some requirement where you want to make sure that any new teams that are created are named in a specific way. So you create one of these policies. your end users don't see the back-end environment. They have no idea that that policy exists. So how can you make sure that users are able to comply with that policy even though they don't know that the policy exists? Well, that's actually something that Microsoft has done a really good job of, is making sure that these naming policies can apply new groups in the way that you require, but without burdening the users with the chore of having to figure out a name for a group that's going to adhere to this arbitrary policy that's been created. So let me show you how that works. There are two things that you can do with a group naming policy. The first thing is that you can apply prefixes and or suffixes to that policy, or to that group name rather. So what this means is that you can apply text before the group name, after the group name, or both before and after. So essentially, when a user goes in and creates a new team, they can call that team basically anything that they want, and then your group naming policy is going to append text either before or after or both. So that's how you get around the challenge of not overburdening users with having to figure out a name that's going to adhere to your policy, but still being able to apply a policy and get that custom group name that's super uniform that you wanted. Now, the other thing that you can do with group naming policies is to come up with a list of banned words. Now, these banned words are words that aren't allowed to be used within a new group that's being created, and thereby extension, a new team that a user is creating. Now, organizations take a variety of approaches to the banned words list. Some organizations try to structure the banned words list in a way that prevents deceptive group naming. So, for example, they might ban users from using words like HR or official or CEO or something like that. Just a way of preventing abuse, a way of preventing the creation of misleading group names. And this has security implications as well, because if somebody did manage to break in and infiltrate the network, then having such a policy in place might prevent them from creating a group with a deceptive name and luring people into that. Now, that's just the way some organizations use these group naming policies. Other organizations use banned word list in other ways. For example, I've heard of organizations using a banned word list as a way of preventing users from inserting swear words into group names or the name of a competitor's product into a group name. There are any number of different uses. Now, you don't have to use the banned words list if you don't want to. There's no rule that says that you have to use those, but Microsoft does make those banned word lists available to you should you choose to use them. And again, you're going to need to have an Azure AD Premium P1 license if you want to use group naming policies. So now that I've kind of given you a crash course in how group naming policies work, let's go ahead and take a look at what's involved in creating one of these policies. Before I do, there are a few things that you have to keep in mind. First of all, the total group name, I'm talking about the portion that the user types in as the group name, plus any prefixes or suffixes that you append to that group name, has to be less than 256 characters in length. Typically, that's not going to be a problem, but every once in a while you may have a user who creates a team with a super long name, thereby creating an underlying group with a long name that violates the requirements of the policy. There are also limits to prefix and suffix lengths. Now, as I'll show you in a few minutes, when you're defining a prefix and a suffix, you have two options. One is to just use a text string. So in other words, you type a string of text, and whatever you've typed in, that becomes the prefix or the suffix. That's where those length restrictions really come into play. The other option is to use Active Directory attributes. And if you choose Active Directory attributes, that more or less circumvents that limit, so you don't have to worry about it. You still have to worry about the 256 character limit, but you don't have to worry about the prefix and suffix lengths. Another thing to keep in mind is that you have to avoid using special characters, things like the @ symbol, the pound sign, brackets, greater than, less than, things like that. And you also have to pay attention to which Active Directory attributes are actually populated. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, let's suppose for a moment that you're creating a group naming policy and you want to make it so that anytime a user creates a new team, which of course creates a new group behind the scenes, that user's department is appended as a suffix to the group name so that you can figure out which department created which teams and which groups. Simple enough. But in order to make that happen, you're going to have to rely on an Active Directory attribute, specifically the departments attribute. And that's absolutely doable. The thing is, if your organization has been lazy about populating Active Directory attributes and departments aren't listed within the Active Directory, then creating that type of policy isn't going to do any good because Active Directory has no information about what department the user who created the group happens to belong to. So the lesson there is to make sure that any Active Directory attributes that you reference are actually populated. Then the next thing is that policies that are created in the Azure, when you're creating these policies, they're done in the Azure AD Admin Center, not in the Teams Admin Center. So not a big deal, just something to be aware of. So let's take a look at how this works. So here I am in the Azure Active Directory Admin Center, and I've selected the groups container, and then in the settings section, in the middle pane on the screen, at the very bottom of the settings section, you'll see the naming policy, which I've selected. So this is where you set up the group naming policy. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there are two elements to a group naming policy, and you can use either one of these elements or both of these elements. The first one being blocked words. And if you look right toward the center of the screen, you'll notice the word blocked words. It's a tab with a blue underline. So the way that you set up blocked words is that you download a CSV file from Microsoft by clicking the blue download button that's on the screen. Now, that CSV file, it's a comma-separated value file. It's something that you can open up in a text editor or open up in Excel. And what you do is you just open that file that Microsoft provides, and you make any changes that are necessary. If there's anything in Microsoft's blocked words file that you don't want to be there, you just get rid of it, no problem. And then you go in and you add any words that you want to block that are specific to your own organization and words that don't already appear on the list. So then you save that CSV file, and then you upload it back up to Azure AD using the upload link at the bottom of the slide. So that's how the blocked words portion works. Now, let's take a look at the group naming policy portion. So you would select the group naming policy tab, and that's going to take you to this screen right here. Now, only the left half of the screen is actually the group naming policy. The right half is just a couple of screen captures that I've added to the slide to show what the process looks like. So what you would do is select the group naming policy tab, and then you'll notice that there are check boxes for add prefix and add suffix. So if you want to add a prefix, you select add prefix. If you want to add a suffix, you select add suffix. Or you can do both, or you can do neither. So once you've made your selection, then if you follow that blue arrow up to the top of the third column on the screen, you can see that there's a drop-down list that appears. And that drop-down list asks you what type of prefix or suffix you want to add. You can add an attribute or you can add a string, as I explained earlier. A string is just a literal string of text. It's whatever you type, that's what gets added. The attribute is pulled from the Active Directory, as I explained a moment ago. So in this particular case, I selected attributes, and if you look at the smaller blue arrow pointing down toward the bottom of the screen, you can see what happens when you select attributes. You choose the attribute option, and then you choose the attribute that you want to add as a prefix or suffix. So in this case, some of the selections that are displayed include department, company, office, state or province, country or region, title, and then the list goes on from there. So you would just make your selection, and then once you're done, you save your changes, and that becomes your group naming policy. So best practice 3, keep apps in check. Now this is kind of an odd one, but the reason why this particular best practice exists is because Teams supports the use of apps within the Teams environment. So you can use app permission policies to control the use of those apps. So what a lot of people will recommend is allowing only Microsoft apps or allowing well-known third-party apps. Now that's just the best practice. That doesn't necessarily mean that that's the way that you have to do things. If you have a particular app that's indispensable within your organization, of course, you should allow that app to be used within Teams. But I want to show you how to put some controls around the apps that you use, or that your users use, rather, in the Teams environment. So let's take a look at how this works. So right now I'm back in the Microsoft Teams Admin Center. I'm not in the Azure AD Admin Center anymore. And you can see that there is a tab called Permission Policies that I've selected. And when you select that, it brings up the App Permission Policy screen. And there's a global policy that exists by default, but you can create your own custom policies. And to do that, you would just click the Add button that's shown on this slide. So from there, that's going to take you to the Add Permission Policy screen. And the screen is fairly simple. You have to provide a description for the policy that you're creating. And then from there, you have sections for Microsoft apps, third-party apps, and custom apps. So Microsoft apps are apps that are provided by Microsoft. Third-party apps are commercial applications from vendors other than Microsoft. And then custom apps are usually apps that are developed within your own organization, or maybe apps that you've downloaded from the internet outside of any app store, things like that. Now, you'll notice that all of these are set to allow all apps by default. So by default, all Microsoft apps are allowed, all third-party apps are allowed, and all custom apps are allowed. Typically, you're going to want to put some constraints on that. So let's take a look at how you might go about doing that. So for the Microsoft Apps option, and for the other options as well, if you click the down arrow in the drop-down, you have a few different choices. Allow all apps, allow specific apps and block all others, block specific apps and allow all others, and block all apps. So let's say that you're in a situation where you don't really want your users using a lot of apps within the Teams environment, but they need access to, I don't know, let's say Acrobat Reader. Well, what you would do in a situation like that is to choose the allow specific apps and block all others. So that way, once you've done that, you can choose an Acrobat Reader as the allowed apps, or as the app that is allowed, and then everything else is disallowed. So then how do you specify which app you want to allow in a situation like that? Well, you'll notice that once you've chosen the allow specific apps and block all others, the allow apps button appears just beneath the drop-down. So you would click that, and then that would give you the opportunity to specify which apps it is that you want to include in the list of allowed apps. So one option is that you can search for the app by name. So just simply type in the name of the app and you're taken to a search results screen where you can choose the app. And this is what that looks like. And you can also just scroll through this list and look for apps, but there are a rather large number of apps. At the time that I made the screen capture, there were almost 2,000 apps on the list, 1,931 to be exact. And there are various filtering mechanisms available so that you can narrow down the list and more easily find whatever it is that you're looking for. Now, another thing that you can do to rein in the use of apps is to set up what's known as an app setup policy. Now, an app setup policy, I want to be really clear about this. This is something that exists for the sake of convenience. It's not really a restrictive mechanism, even though it's called a policy. The idea behind an app setup policy is that it gives you the chance to choose which apps get automatically deployed. It doesn't do anything to stop users from deploying additional apps beyond the ones that you've specified. So let's take a quick look at how to create an app setup policy. So here I am back in the Microsoft Teams Admin Center, and you'll notice that I've expanded the Teams app container, and I've selected the Setup Policies tab. Now, this tab contains several different options. The first thing that you would do is provide a name and a description for the app setup policy that you're creating. From there are a couple of toggles that you can turn on or off. You can enable or disable the ability to upload custom apps, and you can also enable or disable user pinning. And incidentally, if you look down at the bottom of the slide, you can see a list of pinned apps. From there, there's also a section that will allow you to choose which apps and messaging extensions you want to install in your user's own personal Teams environments and in the meetings that they create. And to do that, you would simply click Add Apps, and then you would make your selection from there. So best practice number 4, take the time to understand the Teams architecture. So this is what I was talking about earlier when I mentioned that there were going to be some architectural elements that kind of come into play within the context of this discussion. Teams is really odd in the way that it's constructed because a lot of applications are just built from scratch, and perhaps they have a data type that's specifically associated with that application. For example, Microsoft Exchange Server or Exchange Online stores messages in the Exchange Information Store. SQL Server stores data in a SQL Server database. Even something like Microsoft Word stores data in a docx file. So typically what you have is a specific file type or a specific file repository that's associated with a given application. Well, Teams doesn't work like that. Instead, I tend to think of Teams as being more like a portal that's built on top of other Microsoft 365 services. Now, the reason why that's so important is because what it means is that there's no such thing as Teams data in the strictest sense of the word. Instead, Teams leverages all of these other Microsoft 365 services for its data storage needs. And what that means is that your Teams data is going to be scattered throughout the Microsoft 365 ecosystem. So why does any of this matter? Well, there are actually several different reasons why this is so important to know. First of all, is you have to know where that Teams data lives in order to successfully back it up. I've heard of organizations that will avoid backing up certain Microsoft 365 elements because they simply don't use those particular services. For example, I once heard of an organization that didn't back up SharePoint Online because they don't use SharePoint. But even if you don't use a particular service within Microsoft 365, that doesn't mean that Teams isn't using it. In a few minutes, I'll show you where Teams actually stores the data. The important thing is that if you're not using a Teams-aware backup application, then make sure that whatever backup application you are using is backing up everything possible within the Microsoft 365 environment. That's the only way to make sure that you're capturing all of the data that's associated with Teams. Another reason why it's so important to know about the underlying architecture is that knowing where Teams stores its data can help you not accidentally delete something that you shouldn't. You know, early in my career, I used to work help desk, and I couldn't tell you how many times I ran into situations in which a user's hard disk was filling up, and they didn't know what to do about it, so they just started deleting things that they didn't know what they were. And as you can imagine, that typically caused a variety of problems. So having an awareness of where Teams stores its data can kind of help you to avoid some situation like that. The next point is that understanding the architecture can help you to recover anything that was accidentally deleted, and I'll show you some techniques for that as well. Finally, you might occasionally have to delve into some of the other admin centers, not just the Teams admin center, when implementing various Teams best practices. So that's why it's so important to know where Teams stores its data. So where does Teams store data? Well, what you see here is an excerpt from a really short book that I wrote called Conversational Microsoft Teams Backup, and there's a link at the bottom of the slide where you can download a free copy. At any rate, messaging data is stored in the chat services table. Eventually, Microsoft is planning on bringing that into Cosmos DB, but as far as I know, that hasn't happened just yet. The chat data is also stored in Microsoft Exchange simply for compliance reasons. Images are stored within the media services on Azure using blob storage. And like messaging data, images are imported into Exchange for compliance reasons. Files that users use within Teams are stored in a variety of locations depending on the file type. Generally speaking, Teams files are stored in SharePoint, and then the chat files are stored in OneDrive for Business. Voicemail messages are stored in the individual users' Exchange mailboxes. Recordings are stored in the media services on Azure and blob storage. Calendar meetings are stored in Exchange mailboxes. Contacts are stored in Exchange. And then telemetry data is stored in the Microsoft Data Warehouse. And there's a link in the lower right corner of the slide where you can go to get a lot more detail on this. I'm not trying to do a deep dive into Teams architecture. I just kind of wanted to give you an overview of the various places where Microsoft stores Teams data. So one of the reasons why you need to know all of this is for recovery. You know, what if something is accidentally deleted? You really don't want to have to restore from backup if you don't have to. Well, when you delete an object in Microsoft 365, it might not actually be gone. Microsoft has quite a few different protective mechanisms that will allow you to recover a recently deleted item. This raises the question of, do you actually need to back up Microsoft 365 and Teams? And the answer to that is an overwhelming yes. Because even though these recovery mechanisms exist, sometimes they don't work as advertised. I've seen a couple of situations where something should be recoverable and it just isn't. So at that point, there's no choice but to go to the backup and restore from there. Also, there are typically regulatory reasons for requiring a backup rather than just relying on these convenience mechanisms. And then the third reason is probably the best one of all, self-preservation. You never ever want to be put into a situation where you have to explain to your boss that there's no way of recovering something from Teams because you never backed it up in the first place because you were just simply relying on these convenience mechanisms instead. So with that said, the way that you recover when something is accidentally deleted in Teams really varies depending on what it was that was deleted. Now, as you recall, earlier I mentioned that anytime that you create a new team, there's a group that's created behind the scenes. So if you accidentally delete a team, all you have to do to get that back is to recover the group that was associated with the team. And for that, you're going to have to go into PowerShell. There are two commandlets that you'll have to use. The first one is get Azure AD MS deleted group. It's kind of a long commandlet for sure. But when you enter that commandlet, it's going to give you a list of all of the groups that have been recently deleted. Then once you have that list, you'll enter the restore Azure AD MS deleted directory object commandlet and then specify the ID parameter. And then you're going to provide the ID of the group that you want to recover. And then by doing that, you'll be able to recover the deleted group, thereby recovering the team that corresponds to that group. Now, there are a couple of problems with this type of teams of recovery. The biggest one is that recovering a team is an all-or-nothing operation. You can recover a team, but you can't recover individual items within the team, things like files, chats, etc. So it's all or nothing. You either recover the whole team or you recover nothing at all. So let's quickly talk about some of these other recovery mechanisms. Data that's stored in OneDrive, you can recover that using the OneDrive recycle bin. And that stores items for, the slide says 93 days. What it should probably say is up to 93 days because the retention period is adjustable. And that's assuming that you've got Microsoft 365. If you're using just a standard Microsoft account, the time period is actually 30 days. But what you would do is you would open up OneDrive, and then there's an option to open your OneDrive for Business folder. Don't choose that. Instead, choose the View Online option where you see the green arrow, or the small green arrow rather. That's going to open up OneDrive for Business. From there, you select the Recycle Bin tab, and then that's going to give you the option of restoring the items that you need to recover. Now, if you look at this slide, you can see the Microsoft 365 Admin Center. And I mentioned earlier that the retention period for items deleted from OneDrive is adjustable. In this particular slide, right now the data retention is set to 30 days, and it's set to 1 terabyte per user. So if you click that Manage Data Retention link, you have the chance to adjust some of this. So what other native recovery mechanisms exist? Well, for the SharePoint data, there is a SharePoint recycle bin. Deleted items remain for 93 days. And even beyond that, Microsoft can recover items for another 14 days. But if you have to rely on Microsoft to perform a recovery, they have to recover the entire site collection. They can't recover individual files or even individual sites within a site collection. So this is only something that you would want to do in the most dire of circumstances. And here's what this looks like. This is a really old SharePoint site, but you'll notice the green arrow is pointing toward the SharePoint recycle bin. And once you select that recycle bin, then you have the option of recovering items that are within it. Okay, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit in the interest of time. The Azure AD recycle bin stores Azure Active Directory objects for up to 30 days after they're deleted. And the way that you would access that is through the Azure Active Directory Admin Center. You can see what that looks like right here. You would click on Users and then click on Deleted Users, and the screen capture shows deleted users being in preview. I believe that's not in preview anymore, but this would give you a chance to recover deleted user accounts. Let's see, I am going to skip ahead a little bit because I'm running out of time. So anyway, with regard to Microsoft Teams and the relationship between a team and a group, there's one thing that you have to really think about, is that you want to strike a balance between uncontrolled group growth and inhibiting your users from being able to do their jobs. Some of the best practices that I've read state that you shouldn't necessarily allow users to create teams at will. Instead, try to maintain the minimum possible number of teams and just create channels within those teams rather than creating a new team every time somebody needs a new platform to communicate with. The advantage to doing that is that it'll make teams a little bit more manageable, and it's going to limit the number of Active Directory groups that are created. Now, the other school of thought is that you should never ever put something into place that's going to make users have a more difficult time doing their job. I'll leave it up to you to choose which option is right, but it is something that you need to think about. Another best practice with regard to teams is that every team should have at least 2 owners. So that way, if something needs to happen with a team and the owner of that team happens to be on vacation or out of the office for some reason, somebody else is still able to go in and handle whatever it is that needs to be taken care of. And I am quickly running out of time, so I am going to skip ahead because there's something else I want to talk about. Now, when it comes to teams, as I mentioned, every time that you create a team, there's an Azure AD group that's created in the background. Now, these groups can be assigned statically or they can be assigned dynamically. So a static group is just that. It's a group where you go in and you add members to it manually. So this gives you a lot of control of who is going to be a member of that particular team that's associated with that group. The dynamic option populates group membership based on Active Directory attributes. Now, dynamic groups are a lot simpler from an administrative standpoint, but they don't give you that fine level control, because if you need to add somebody to a group on an ad hoc basis, you're not going to be able to do that if it's a dynamic group. They would have to meet the criteria that is defined within the group to be automatically added to that. You can't just go in and manually add them. Another limitation with regard to dynamic groups is that dynamic groups can contain users, they can contain devices, but they can't contain both. Now, in the case of teams, you would obviously build a dynamic group around users, not around devices. And dynamic groups require you to have an Azure AD Premium P1 subscription. So a few things to keep in mind regarding dynamic groups. First of all, you can dynamically assign group members, but you can't dynamically assign group owners. Those group owners are going to have to be statically assigned to that group. As I mentioned earlier, if you are using dynamic membership, you're not going to be able to manually add individual people to the group later on. That group membership is going to be based solely on the criteria that you've established for dynamically adding members to the group. Another thing to remember about dynamic groups, and this is a big one, is that the rules that you put in place that cause users to be added or removed to that group can sometimes cause people to be removed from the group unexpectedly. If, for example, a user were to move to a different department, they may suddenly find that they lose access to certain groups that they previously had access to simply because attributes within the Active Directory environment have changed for that user and they no longer qualify to be a member of that particular group. One last thing that I want to go ahead and talk about is external users. External users are a big subject in a lot of organizations simply because we don't work in a vacuum. Almost every organization out there collaborates with the outside world in some way. And in a Teams environment, that's often done through external users. So the reason why this matters is because there's nothing stopping a user from adding an external user to a team. And if you've got something sensitive in that team, well, that can end up being a problem. So it's important to think about how you want to handle external users. Remember, external users become group members, and because they are group members, those external users receive access to anything that that particular group has access to. So one of the best practices here that's not listed on the slide or anything is to make your group single purpose in nature. Okay, you create a new team, and by extension, a group is created within Azure AD because that team was created. Well, you don't want to be using that group for any other purpose, such as controlling access to other resources that have nothing to do with the team. Because if somebody does add an external user to that group, well, then by extension, that external user is going to gain access to anything that that group has access to. And that could end up being a big problem. Another thing to keep in mind is that a lot of times external users aren't removed at the end of a project, and that group membership may persist indefinitely. This tends to happen more in larger organizations. It's just one of those things that gets overlooked. But make sure that your users do understand the importance of removing external users once there's no need for them to be there. You're going to need some sort of procedure for cleaning up group memberships. So how do you go about doing it? Well, there isn't really an automated method for cleaning up external users, but one thing that you can do to clean up groups is to automate team lifecycle management. And the way that you do that is through group lifecycle management policies. Because as I've said several times, teams are tied to groups, and group life cycles can be automated. So once a group expires, it can be automatically deleted, and then when that group is automatically deleted, the team that corresponds to that group is also deleted. So let's take a look at how this works. So right now you see a slide with the Azure Active Directory Admin Center. And what I've done is I've selected the groups container, and then I've clicked on expiration, and you can see what's involved in creating a group expiration policy. So the first option is the group lifetime, and you enter this in days. In other words, how long should this group exist after it's been created? That's what you would put into the group lifetime in days field. And incidentally, it's really important to remember that you're only allowed to create one group expiration policy for the entire organization. So you're not going to be able to have different policies for different departments so that you've got different expiration times for different groups. It doesn't really work that way. The next thing that you have to put in is an email contact for groups with no owners. So typically if a group is getting ready to expire, then the owner is notified and they have a chance to renew that group so that it doesn't get deleted. But if that group doesn't have an owner for some reason, then Azure AD is going to need somebody that it can contact to notify that the group is about to expire. And then the last option on the screen is group expiration for Microsoft 365 groups. So you can set this policy to all groups. So every group out there, or I should say every Microsoft 365 group out there is subject to the policy. Another option is to apply the policy to select groups. And then the third option is not to apply the policy to any groups. Now, one thing that you're going to have to consider about this is that you may have certain people out there that own a really large number of groups. And if that's the case, they can end up, depending on how you apply the policy, they could be bombarded with expiration notifications. Their mailbox might be flooded with notes saying, hey, this group's about to expire. Do you want to renew it? Yes or no? Well, thankfully, Microsoft has provided a mechanism that will reduce the workload for group owners, and that is automatic renewal. So there are certain types of activity that will trigger an automatic renewal. Generally speaking, an automatic renewal is triggered by accessing a resource that's associated with a group. But simply accessing the resource may or may not be enough depending on what the resource is. For example, if you simply open a SharePoint site, that isn't going to be enough to renew a group that's associated with that SharePoint site. But if you open a SharePoint site and then you add content to it, that would typically trigger an automatic renewal, and then the group owner wouldn't necessarily be notified that they need to renew the group. It would simply be renewed automatically. Now, a few things to keep in mind with regard to all of this is that when you set up an expiration policy, any groups that are already older than the period that you've specified are going to be set to expire in 35 days unless they are automatically renewed or the group owner renews it. So groups that would have already expired are going to be set to have an expiration period of 35 days. Another thing to think about is that you may have dynamic groups that get expired as a result of one of these policies, which is fine. But if at a later time you decide you need to restore that group, you can restore it. But because that group is dynamic, it's initially going to be empty, and it can take up to 24 hours for that group to be repopulated based on the rules that define the group membership. And then finally, the last thing that I want to mention is that when you go in and you select specific groups that you want to expire, because if I go back to the screen, remember, we can apply the policy to all groups or to selected groups. So a lot of organizations will simply apply the policy to selected groups rather than applying it to every single group, because there are some groups that probably shouldn't be expired automatically. So if you're applying the policy to selected groups, there is a 500 group limit. You can't go beyond that. If you need to go beyond that, then the only way to accomplish that is to simply apply the policy to all groups. So with that said, I am about out of time, but I want to leave a couple of minutes here at the end to take any questions that people might have.
Okay, great job, Brian. We do have some questions, and I'd like to remind the audience that we can take questions up until about 5 minutes to the top of the hour in order to give you a short break before the next session, so please send them on in now. We have a few minutes. And let's go to the Q&A box. We'll just go first come, first serve. And that would be a question from Leopold. He says, regarding external users or users in general, like an employee left the company, is there a way to disable a user if he/she has not logged in after X number of days?
That is a really good question. I don't know of any mechanisms that exist at the Azure AD level, like no switch that you can flip to set a policy to do that, but it can absolutely be done through PowerShell. I've actually written scripts that will do exactly that. What you can do is use the get AD user commandlet, and then there's a parameter that you can look at. I forget what the name of the parameter is, but you can check to see how recently that user has logged on. And then once you've done that, you can check to see how many days have passed since that user has logged on. And if it's more than a certain length of time, then you can disable that user using the set AD user commandlet.
Cool. Is that PowerShell script published online anywhere for users to get a hold of?
Quite possibly. I have written about that at some point. It was fairly recently, but for the life of me, I cannot remember where it was published to. It may not have even been published yet. It could still be going through editing, but it should be out there somewhere. If not right now, it should be out there pretty soon.
Okay, great. Leopold also has another question. How do you restore the items that were deleted in Teams, OneDrive, etc.? Will you get a folder with the contents and then you just have to sort it out? Or will they replace the content in Teams and OneDrive?
No, typically when you're restoring a team, it's all or nothing. So if you're restoring a team, you're restoring everything within that team. So all of those files and chat items and all that should show back up where they used to be without you having to do anything. Now, having said that, every backup application works a little bit differently, so I can't say with 100% certainty that that rule is absolute, but generally that's what you should expect.
Okay. Next question comes from Dave. Do you know if/when Teams Enterprise will support SMS without third-party support?
That's another really interesting question. I've heard rumors that it's coming, but I haven't heard anything official from Microsoft, so I couldn't tell you. I really don't know.
All right. Another question from the inquisitive Leopold. Regarding setup of the tenant itself, how can I set up the tenant in a specific geographic region while not being in the geo itself? Can it be done via VPN, or do I have to connect to a PC in that geo in order to connect to the geo's data centers?
I think it's really going to vary depending on how your own organization is set up. I don't see any reason why you couldn't VPN and do it. Again, it's just going to depend on how you're set up.
Okay, we have time for one or two more questions. Let's go to the Q&A box. Is there any reason why you need to allow users to use apps through Teams?
No, there's no rule that says that you absolutely have to allow app use. Generally, what happens, though, is that organizations will initially not be using any apps with Teams, and then as users start doing more collaborative tasks through Teams, they're using it for more than just video conferencing. They're collaborating on documents and that sort of thing. They might realize a need for a particular app. I used Acrobat Reader as an example in the presentation. So at that point, you might be able to start bringing in the apps that the users really need that would make them more effective at doing their job. But no, there's no rule that says you have to use apps.
All right, let's squeeze in one more question. Can a group naming policy do anything other than to append prefixes and suffixes?
No, you can append prefixes and suffixes, and you can supply a list of words that shouldn't be used in a group name, the banned words list, but that's really all that you can do.
All right, that was such a quick question and answer. We have time for one more. We'll just keep this baby rolling. Is it better to standardize team creations or to minimize them?
There's really two schools of thought on that. Some organizations do like to standardize team creation, and they'll end up with a whole bunch of different teams, and they like to have them set up in a consistent way so that way if a user joins a new team, they already know what to expect. They know how that team is going to be laid out. And that templates can be really helpful in that regard. Other organizations try to reduce the clutter and make it a lot easier for users to navigate by greatly restricting teams and preventing users from creating teams that they don't need. It's really just a matter of which approach is best suited to your own organization. There isn't necessarily a right or wrong way to do it.
Okay, cool. Well, it looks like that's all the questions we have time for. So thanks again, Brian, for an excellent presentation and answering all those questions.
Thanks for having me.